This is in our series, and we've got 3 more to go. We've got 2 more already listed on the website, and the 3rd one will pop up here shortly as soon as we finalize the date. So excited to have you guys with us. Please use our chat feature to engage with us, ask Kyle all the questions that you have as we go along. Feel free to interrupt him as we're going along, no big deal. Plus, we'll also have time at the end for you to ask questions. So if you don't already know, Bear Care was established in 2007, and we are here to help foster improvements for the welfare of bears through conservation and education and communication. So doing webinars is part of this now. We are hopeful that we'll have a conference, that we get to see everyone's faces again, a hybrid or maybe another virtual one in the future as well. So stay tuned to our website for that. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Kyle. Kyle is joining us with our webinar series. We're super happy to have him on board. He is a zookeeper at the Toronto Zoo and has worked in the field for about 10 years. He became very passionate about behavioral husbandry for the animals in his care and founded Wild Enrichment in 2018. So this company is dedicated to help improve the welfare of captive animals through the advancement of behavioral husbandry practices. Wild Enrichment provides enrichment field guides, articles, resources, and training and enrichment concepts, as well as consulting services for facilities to start a world-class enrichment program and help existing ones. So super happy on this topic, super happy to have you, Kyle. Thanks for joining us. I'll be posting a handout to the chat so you guys can review those just in case anyone didn't get it through email communication prior to today, and also a link to his website as we're going through this. So with that, I'll stop sharing, Kyle, so you can take over.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction. And thank you to the Bear Care group for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be, talking about some of the topics that I'm passionate about, and hopefully you learn something today and start thinking a little bit about your current enrichment program and use some of these topics that I sort of talk about today. But really, the presentation today is going to be on this wild approach to bear enrichment and really the fundamentals of a goal-based enrichment program for any bear species, but not only for bear species. I think a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about today is transferable to a lot of different species. So I'm sure a lot of you that are tuning in aren't necessarily specialist keepers. I'm by no means a bear expert. So a lot of these topics come from a large group of animals, and I think you'll be able to sort of apply these to a lot of different situations. So you've already got a bit of an intro here. As Angela mentioned, there should have been most of you guys should have a handout that sort of goes with this presentation. Instead of putting a bunch of references on each slide and talking about things that not everybody has access to, I figured it would be a little bit easier if there was a central handout that had everything that I was talking about, a lot of the references, not only references, but also further reading that you'll be able to reference throughout this presentation, and also sort of read some of the things that I read and some of the articles that I used and references that I used to sort of land on a lot of the same conclusions as me, hopefully. So I'll also be referencing a couple attachments to that handout as well. So if you want a closer look at those, that'll be there. My contact information is on this slide. It's also on the handout. If you want to sort of reach out to me about any of the topics that we talk about or individual situations, just given the nature of this sort of webinar format, it's pretty hard to talk about a lot of these topics in depth. I could probably do 5 different webinars on just the topics we're going to be talking about today. So if you want any more information, hopefully the handout helps you with that. If you want even more, you're welcome to reach out to me later. So yeah, so let's get into it. So this is sort of the outline today. We're going to be talking about the importance of enrichment for bears. Obviously, that's going to be the obvious overarching topic with everything. So We're going to be talking about this wild approach and why I sort of named this webinar a wild approach to bear enrichment. We're going to be talking about natural behaviors, contra freeloading, goal setting and evaluation as it pertains to an enrichment program, the importance of novel enrichment in a behavioral husbandry program. We're going to talk about a case study that sort of brings a lot of the topics that we talk about together. We're going to talk about an MVP and how that relates to an enrichment program. And then we're going to have a question period. But as Angela mentioned, if you have a burning question and you really want, you think you're going to forget it, definitely interrupt me or put it in the chat bar and we'll address it right there. And I don't want anybody forgetting questions later. But if you want, there will be a question period at the end of the presentation. So this isn't really something that I feel like we need to spend a whole lot of time on, because by virtue of being here, everybody probably understands the importance of enrichment for bears. Anybody that's worked with any bear species, my particular experience is usually with polar bears and grizzly bears. That's where a lot of my bear specific experience comes from. But I'm sure a lot of you that have worked with other species of bears understand that these animals are prone to stereotypies. They're capable of complex decision making. They show a really diverse and complex behavior repertoire. So in captivity and in the wild, and really their feeding methods and seasonality. And there's a bunch of different factors that vary quite a bit in the wild. So all that really comes together in a very, very complex animal that really needs a robust behavioral husbandry program in captivity in order to thrive. So that's sort of why we're talking about bears in particular here. So let's talk about this, this wild approach and what that really means. And this is sort of an overarching concept through the enrichment program that I really like to think about. And when I talk about this word wild, I'm really referring to the natural behaviors and tendencies of some of these animals. What they're doing in the wild? What are their tendencies? Some of these behaviors that we'll be talking about quite a bit in this presentation. So often I talk about this topic of enrichment versus stuff, and this is something that I feel like a lot of animal care staff really fall into. It's sort of a trap that a lot of animal care staff fall into. And by labeling something enrichment before you've even really given it to an animal. And I think this picture on the right here is a good one to talk about while we're mentioning this topic. This is Humphrey, one of the polar bears at the Toronto Zoo. Humphrey loves to bring all of his enrichment items, everything in his exhibit, he likes to bring inside to sort of interact with. He does interact with things on exhibit, but he really it really expresses a lot of natural behaviors and a lot of interaction with these items inside. So every now and then we like to bring all of our items inside, and we like to fill the whole house with enrichment and just let him go absolutely nuts, put him in there by himself. He really loves it. But before I sort of told you that, this picture, without that sort of information that I just gave you, this is a picture of a polar bear in a pen with a bunch of random items. These aren't necessary. The only thing that really makes them enrichment is the fact that this animal is interacting with the enrichment item, and they're actually being enriched by the enrichment item. So it's just something to think about that I really like to think about when looking at these sort of enrichment items is, are they actually enriching, and not just falling into the trap of putting a ball into an exhibit that the animal doesn't interact with and doesn't really find enriching, because that's just stuff, that's not enrichment. So this wild approach is reliable and repeatable, because a lot of these sort of natural behaviors come from the wild, and we'll be talking a lot about that and why that's important. And it really allows programs to be goal-based, and it really allows these metrics of success to be easily defined. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's sort of the overarching wild approach and why I like to sort of talk about that. So A good place to start is targeting natural behaviors. This is sort of something that's obvious to a lot of people, but in case it's not, I really believe that any enrichment program should have a backbone made up of enrichments that targets natural behaviors. So what I mean by that is you really want a lot of your program and your enrichment items and your enrichment techniques to really be centered around these sort of natural behaviors and tendencies. Before you start, branching out into experimental things or putting things in an animal exhibit without really a goal in mind, just to try things out, I really think it's important to have this sort of backbone of these natural behaviors and tendencies. And that sort of brings us to this variety and variation. And what I mean by that is you really want a variety of enrichment devices and techniques, but you also want a variation in the amount of natural behaviors that you're targeting. If you have 1,000 enrichment items and techniques that's in your sort of enrichment tool belt, but you're only targeting 1 or 2 natural behaviors in an animal, that's really something that you should be thinking about, because is doing the same thing with a bunch of different enrichment items as enriching as performing a lot of natural behaviors with fewer enrichment items. So just something to be thinking about. So there's this question, obviously, of how to find and exploit these natural behaviors. And this is a whole other presentation in and of itself, but a lot of the questions that I really like to ask myself, not only with bears, but a lot of different animals, is, how is this bear acquiring food in the wild? How is it spending most of its time in the wild? This is obviously however the animal is spending a lot of its time in the wild is a lot of the time what you want to be focusing on in captivity and with the animals that you're working with, and particularly with bears, there's a lot of seasonal variation. With grizzly bears and polar bears, there's a lot of calorie variation depending on what season it is. So thinking of those seasonal variations and how to really exploit a lot of these changes, and how these natural behaviors are sort of retargeted and shuffled up depending on the season, I think is super important. So we're talking a lot about natural behaviors, but at the end of the day, you're not making an enrichment program, this behavioral husbandry program, for the species as a whole. You're making it for the individuals you're working with and the animals that are specifically in this exhibit. So that's something that you really need to keep in mind, because you really want to recognize the biases that you might have, that you're putting on the animal, that are really sort of potentially limiting how enriching this program could be. Taking Humphrey, the bear from that picture a few slides ago, this is a bear. Obviously, in my mind, I feel like interacting with an enrichment item in a large exhibit or in a pool is really what's going to be beneficial for this animal. But if I look at the individual, obviously he's getting a lot more enriching experiences inside, because he's bringing all of his enrichment items that we give him inside anyway. So maybe this is something that I should be focusing on when presenting enrichment to this animal. So you are making the enrichment program for an individual or a group of individuals. So always keeping that in mind is really, really paramount to a lot of these concepts. So you definitely don't want to overwrite that at any time. So a lot of the time when people visualize natural behaviors, they really get stuck in very, very complex behaviors. Obviously, in the wilds, bears can be performing behaviors that are very complex and that build on each other and that are very, very hard to emulate. But again, it's about the variation of different natural behaviors, and they don't all have to be complex. And this sort of varies seasonally, and that's why I like this video here. This is of 2 grizzly bears, both performing the same natural behavior based on enrichment foraging items that we put out for them. Grizzly bears in the wild, they spend a ton of their time, especially when they wake up from hibernation, digging through, for roots and tubers, potentially like frozen animals from previous winters. So if grizzly bears are digging in the wild, this is a very, very easy natural behavior that you can target, and then one that you should be trying to get your grizzly bears to be doing in captivity. So I like it because it's a very, very simple natural behavior, but sometimes that's great if you can get them to do that. Then these simple natural behaviors are one. There's a lot of those low-hanging fruits that you can really focus on before maybe targeting a lot of different more complex natural behaviors. All right, so we'll just, I know some of these questions, it's a little bit awkward in this sort of format, but just to give people ideas and to sort of get everyone thinking about different natural behaviors, I'd like to ask, what are some of the natural behaviors you like to focus on in the bears that you're working with? And if it's easily explainable, how do you do it? If you just want to, we'll just take a minute here, and if you want to post that in the chat, I'll sort of read them off. If we don't have a whole lot, we'll just move on. But I thought it'd be a good way to sort of give people some ideas and sort of get everyone's brains turning here. So we'll just take a minute. So using their sense of smell and scent marking by giving different scents and smears in the enclosure, shrimp paste and dried shrimp is a favorite. That's fantastic. I haven't heard of shrimp paste before, so that's really cool. And we've already got some questions for later, which is good. If you think of any that you don't want to ask right away, just post it in the chat bar there. Foraging, changing locations of daily scatters by breaking the yard up into quadrants. Yeah, that's great. Pounce is great with polar bears. We'll be talking a little bit about pounce with polar bears a little bit later. So swimming, an easy one to toss high value items into the pool while they are watching. Okay, that's great. If you think of any more, definitely post them in the chat bar there. But that's great to get everybody thinking about different natural behaviors, and you might not even really be thinking about specific natural behaviors when you're giving bears enrichment. So by breaking it down into different natural behaviors, I think it can be super beneficial there. Okay, so contra freeloading. So this is a topic I really like to talk about pretty often on my website and in podcasts and things like that, because it's a sort of a newer topic, but it's a concept that's been around for a little while. So I really think that's really important for almost all bear species, but not only bear species. I think it can be applied to a whole variety of different animals that you may be working with on a daily basis, and something that you can apply if you're not a sort of specialist zookeeper to a lot of different areas that you're working in. So contra freeloading is a psychological term first coined in the 1960s by a Dr. Glenn Jensen, a psychologist. And really the definition is it's a type of behavior in which an organism, when given the choice between food that requires no effort to obtain and food that does require effort to obtain, chooses the food that requires effort. So that's a little bit of a confusing definition. Essentially, it boils down to, it's been shown that a lot of animals prefer to work for their food as opposed to getting it for free. And this makes a whole lot of sense when you think of natural behaviors and how animals are spending a lot of their days. Bears in the wild can be spending an immense amount of time foraging for food, especially low calorie food. Depending on the season, they can spend the majority of their day foraging. So it really makes a whole lot of sense. And I think when you're thinking about contra freeloading in captivity, the main sort of concept that you should really be focusing on is this overall concept of foraging time, and how that varies in captivity versus the wild. This is going to vary a lot depending on the species that you're working with. But looking a good place to start, and a good sort of goal to have in your mind with contra freeloading is looking at how long this animal, this wild counterpart is spending foraging in the wild versus how long this animal in captivity is spending foraging. You know, if you have an animal that's spending 15, 16, 17 hours a day foraging for food, but then in captivity, the same animal is spending 15, 16, 17 minutes foraging for their diet. That's a pretty large disparity there, and that's something that I really think you can sort of start goal setting around, and sort of bring this concept of contra freeloading into your enrichment program. I've posted in that handout some of the original studies by Glenn Jensen, and how he sort of came up with this topic. And he did it with rats. He had 200 rats in this cage, and he presented them with a dish of free food. It was the same food item as he put in a device that the rats essentially had to press this bar and release the same food items. They had to press it a certain amount of time, and he found almost every single rat in the study preferred to press this bar. And since then, it's really been shown in everything from cows, which I posted in the handout, to grizzly bears, which is a little bit more relevant to this topic. So it really is a well-studied topic, but obviously, as with a lot of animals, there's just not the research with specific exotic animals. So it's something that you can sort of experiment with a lot of the individuals that you're working with. But if you are looking to implement this into your behavioral husbandry program for really any animal that you're working with, I think the best way of doing that is by starting small, especially depending on the individual. If it's an individual that's eaten out of a dish its entire life, putting 100% of its diet in different enrichment items, or making it work for 100% of its diet, might not end up very well for the animal. It might not really even know where to start. So taking 95% of the food and offering that for free, and then 5% in an enrichment item, or some sort of thing that it has to work for, like the video that we showed previously of the grizzly bears digging. Starting small and really working your way up, I think, is the best way to start bringing this concept of contra freeloading into your behavioral husbandry program. But again, this can be a whole separate presentation, so we'll move on here a little bit. But this is just a slide I wanted to reiterate. When you're thinking about offering 100% of the diets not for free, you're really thinking of that's a sort of overwhelming thing to be thinking of, because that seems like a lot of time, but it doesn't always have to be very, very complex. In that video of the grizzly bears digging, originally, this picture on the left is really how we did that, just by taking a bunch of low calorie foraging food, peanuts and different seeds, spreading those throughout the exhibit. That can take the bears 2 days to find all of the foraging items there. So it doesn't always have to be super complicated. And obviously on the right here, despite being a funny picture, it is sort of a form of contra freeloading, taking this simple wobble device and putting food in it. Really, the concept is getting the animal to work for their food as opposed to getting it for free. So it doesn't have to be a super complicated thing to implement into your enrichment program. So another topic and sort of another foundation of a really effective enrichment program, I think, is incorporating a lot of novel enrichment, because novel enrichment is really, really powerful enrichment. Obviously, we've talked about the variation and variety. This is something that you should be thinking of, implementing novel enrichment to sort of target that variation and variety. but I posted a couple studies in the handout, but novel enrichment really seems to have great and really long-lasting results on a variety of animals, especially when targeting negative behaviors or stereotypies or anything like that, group dynamics. So it's really, really important it's a really important thing to really be thinking about and trying to implement into your enrichment program. And this kind of boils down into a metric that we'll talk about later. When was the last novel enrichment experience you presented that animal with? That's something that you might want to record or think about to sort of judge when the next novel enrichment experience should be, or if you're overdue for that. There's not necessarily a formula for each animal. It's something that you should experiment with, obviously depending on the individual you're working with. But I have here this enrichment roadmap that's on the handout actually. Zoom in here so you can kind of see it a little bit better. But this is the sort of process that I go through when designing these novel enrichment items, and something to really think about here. Obviously, starting with researching natural history. We had talked about that a few slides ago. This is going to really form the background of your research and your reasoning for making this novel enrichment item. Also, obviously, focusing on the individual. So establishing a goal or behavior. We're going to talk a little bit more about those goals later. And how to come up with them and why they're important. Designing your item, spending the time really designing the item, thinking of different flaws. This is going to be easier and harder depending on the person. Some people are visual. Some people find this really hard, but getting a team together to really think about the design, thinking about your goals and how you're going to accomplish them. Thinking of safety concerns with bears. They are generally very, very heavy animals, and with a lot of weight and strength comes a lot of potential safety concerns. So thinking of those, making sure the enrichment item is robust enough for the bear in question. Actually building the enrichment item, coming up with an introduction plan can be super important, especially with a bear, because a lot of these animals we can't just walk in with, place the enrichment item down and then pull it out when we need to. So coming up with that plan of how you're going to deal with potentially the enrichment program, the enrichment item not having the desired effect. So thinking about that, introducing and monitoring it, reevaluating and implementing any sort of changes you need to make to the enrichment item. There's nothing wrong with taking it out, going back to the drawing board. If it didn't work out, this is again for the individual. So something that you might have seen on the internet might not have the same effect to the animal that you're working with. So, and then something we're going to talk about more later, evaluating for effectiveness over time is super important as well. And that's really going to set your enrichment program up for success in the long term. So let's talk about goal-based programming here. So having set goals that you are continuously evaluating is one of the most important things that you can implement into your enrichment program and your behavioral husbandry program. So, and one of the biggest, whenever you're evaluating something, making sure that your team members are on the same page with evaluation is going to be the most important thing, because without this, your evaluation is almost meaningless. If you work with small teams, as I'm sure a lot of us do, when you have, if you're, evaluating an enrichment program, a 5 out of 10 is just really not working the way you want it to the last few times you've given it to an animal, but the rest of your team is giving it a 10 out of 10 without really evaluating it. On paper, it really looks like that enrichment item is just not working for you. And that really kind of skews the data over the long term, especially if you're going to be looking at it. So making sure your entire team is on the same page is hugely important for this. Sitting down, talking about those goals, talking about what each of these goals looks like and what these natural behaviors look like, what metrics of success look like. That's super, super important. Speaking of metrics of success and these sort of things you should track, this is going to vary a lot based on the animal and based on your specific situation, what you're able to do. But some of the things that I like to track and some of the things I like to think about is the first one, and one of the most important ones, especially when we're talking about natural behaviors, is was the natural behavior performed? If you're giving an enrichment item with the sole goal of bringing out, that pouncing behavior in a polar bear, and it doesn't perform the pouncing behavior, then you haven't accomplished the goal. And making it cut and dry like that is super beneficial, especially when you are working with a team, because that's very easy for the team to sort of get on board with. And it's a yes or no question. Was the behavior performed? Contra freeloading is something you might want to be tracking. So the percentage of free food that animal received that day is usually the best metric to actually track over the long term. And we just talked about this. When was the last novel enrichment experience this animal received? That's something super important. Obviously, the natural behavior, the novel enrichment items can have a very, very long-lasting effect. And I think I glazed over it there in the last slide, but maybe looking if you haven't had a novel enrichment experience over a certain amount of time. Really, weighing the pros and cons of good daily enrichment versus a great enrichment experience less frequently is something that you should be doing. Maybe sacrificing 3 days worth of great enrichment in order to really set up this fantastic novel enrichment experience for the animal is something you want to experiment with. Again, this is going to vary a lot based on your individuals. Yeah, it's something that you should be thinking about, and definitely something that I think would be beneficial to track, just to see, and sort of adding these intervals that you could be providing these novel enrichment experience. And that's going to vary based on your team and environment there. But also foraging time, this sort of goes with contra freeloading. This is a super hard one to track before you decide to track this. This is a hard one to track because a lot of us are strapped for time. We have other animals to work with and to service every single day, so we can't necessarily be staying in front of the exhibit and watching this foraging time to get an idea of what it is. But if you have surveillance on your exhibit, potentially part of the routine should be getting an idea of what the foraging time looks like, what your bears are doing as far as foraging, and how you can sort of improve that over time is something that would be great to track. At the end of the day here, it's important to not be a data hoarder. If you decide to track any of these things, don't just put them in a folder and never look at them again, because you don't really have an idea then of how your enrichment program is doing over time. The only way it can really progress over time, and the only way you can confidently really say you have an effective enrichment program, is by having this data, being able to say, this was my foraging time a month ago, we made it a goal to improve it, and now it's here. That's really how you're going to progress and really reimagine your enrichment program. So now we're going to talk about real world applications. So we're going to talk you through a case study that we did with some grizzly bears. So with this case study, I didn't want it to just be applicable just to bears. I think using a lot of the concepts that we just discussed, you can sort of apply this to a lot of different animals. We're going to be focusing on natural behaviors, sort of walking you through my thought process when we were designing this enrichment item and implementing it. And we're doing this in a way that most facilities could do. I just said we're actually implementing an enrichment item. This is an enrichment item that is built with a lot of things that most facilities should have laying around. So I think it's something that most people will be able to transfer to their enrichment program. So this was done in the Toronto Zoo grizzly bear exhibit. we have two 20-ish-year-old bears, a male named Samson and a female named Shinte. You can see Shinte on the right, looking adorable. So these guys have a solid enrichment program. It's come a long way, especially in the last few years. There's no obvious stereotypies or behaviors that we really need to worry about with these guys. But as you know, a lot of zoos with animals that have been in the same facility for a long time, these guys are very routine based. So we'll get into that during this case study. So something that I like to do here is this initial evaluation, just starting from scratch, trying to get rid of all your preconceived notions of the enrichment program, and just trying to look for deficiencies and ways that you can make your enrichment program better. So we started by setting up a trail camera. So we set this up for around 2 weeks, and just to get an idea of the what the grizzly bears are doing. This exhibit doesn't have any sort of surveillance or anything like that. So we found while reviewing all this trail cam footage after about 2 weeks, we found that these bears are super active during what I'm calling keeper times. At that time of year, excuse me, we were in their exhibits right around 9 a.m., a little bit after, and we were going home for the day around 5 p.m. And I just said the first feed was generally around 9. And never once during this 2-week period was the camera ever tripped outside of this window. So these bears were very, very routine based. Again, not really showing any sort of negative behaviors based on this, but just something that I really flagged as something that we can improve on. Just a little note on trail cameras here. They're fantastic and generally very inexpensive. If you don't have surveillance on your exhibits, setting up a trail cam at separate intervals can be absolutely fantastic. You can really get an insight that you just can't get otherwise. So here's an example. Samson and Shinte, they've been together for 20 some odd years. They know each other very, very well ever since they were cubs, but we never really see them interacting with each other in a way that can be viewed as positive. They never have really negative interactions, or it just seems like they just live together and they just go about their lives. So we were reviewing the trail camera footage, and we found tons and tons of video of these behaviors, which we had never seen with our own eyes before. So these guys sparring and playing and clearly having positive interactions, which is absolutely huge for an enrichment program. You know, when you're under the impression that these individuals aren't really getting enrichment, being enriched from each other, and finding out that in fact they're doing this for sometimes hours a day, that's absolutely huge for your enrichment program, you know? So this is better than we could have even anticipated, because it's nice to know that all of the enrichment isn't just coming from the keepers and the environments. They are actually getting enrichment from each other. So if you haven't had any sort of surveillance on your exhibit, definitely set up some, because it's absolutely fantastic. So now we'll talk about what behaviors to focus on and the goal setting that we're going to be doing here. So grizzlies in the wild are adaptable and change their activity times based on the time of year and the food sources that they're really exploiting that time of year. So we wanted to sort of replicate that and get these bears out of this, their rigid activity times, because we thought that would be really, really beneficial and something that we could easily, define and make a goal. So, and we decided to do this with a specific enrichment item, as it'd be easy to sort of transfer this enrichment item to other facilities and to other animals besides bears. So So thankfully, I'm not giving a presentation on art because that would be a terribly disappointing presentation. But this nonetheless is my sort of design that I originally came up with for this enrichment item. And this is essentially a gravity timed feeding device. There are companies that do these sort of timed feeders and time delay feeders, but they're generally very, very expensive and sometimes hard to set up in an exhibit. So we set out to sort of make our own that would have the same sort of effect. And essentially it's a siphon sort of time device where you have one jug of water. The water slowly gets siphoned from one jug into another, and that jug sort of pulls on this sort of assembly that eventually releases food. And you can kind of see my terrible drawing of the dead tree they have in their exhibit. You'll see a picture in a minute. The pulley system and all that is behind the fence, so the bears can't get to it. But I had this very, very complex sort of slow feeder that would slowly, in my mind, would slowly release these food items, and would be very, very complex to make, but very effective. And this is sort of the prompt I want to use to talk about this concept of the minimum viable product, this MVP. This is actually a business term. It comes from the Lean Startup by Eric Weiss. And it essentially boils down into the simpler plan often being the better one. In the case of enrichment, the simpler item often being the better one. He talks about a lot of people getting stuck in this analysis paralysis phase, and everyone that's coming up with enrichment has probably been there and experienced that. Like, you just don't even know where to start, how to even build this enrichment item. How to you don't have the skills to do it. So instead, really asking yourself, what's the easiest and simplest way to safely accomplish this goal that you're sort of setting out with this specific enrichment item, because there's probably a simpler way to do it. In this picture, this is actually the enrichment that I was talking about earlier that brings out the pouncing behavior in a polar bear. I had this grand plan for years now of making this sort of platform that the polar bears would pounce on, and it would go down and it would release food somehow. And it was this holy grail of enrichment that I sort of had in my mind. But at the end of the day, that was years ago, and I never made any progress with it. It would need multiple departments. It would probably cost thousands of dollars. Well, one weekend, my colleagues, they got a tractor tire, and they wove, this is it being built here, wove a fire hose in that sort of pattern on top of the tractor tire, and they put it in with the bears, and the bears pounced on it all the livelong day. So, this is a good example of, I had this grand plan, but this enrichment item delivers the exact same result. And this is the one that we can offer these bears immediately. So that is the better enrichment item, so you really need to be thinking of what's actually possible for your facility. It's great to dream, but at the end of the day, the enrichment item that you can actually use to enrich the animal quickly, instead of, it's not enriching to your animal when it's in your mind. So the one that you can really realize the quickest is the best enrichment item in my mind. So keeping this concept of the MVP in your mind when you're thinking about enrichment items and novel enrichment items can really go a long way. So so back to our case study here. We're just talking about this device testing right now. Won't spend too much time on this, but on the left there is the picture of this bin. I just made a quick frame for it, and it tips over and dumps food out. That was my sort of MVP to that complex device that I had originally come up with. In the middle there, we're just testing this sort of siphon system. These two jugs are connected by a catheter line that you can restrict the flow on, make it slower or faster. So that was the basic device that would be for the timed feeder. And then we have it hanging. We're testing heights. A lot of these bears can be a lot taller than you think. So if this is an item that you don't want the bear to get, it's sometimes good to make some sacrificial items to get an idea of what they could actually reach, what they're going to go for, are they going to climb. So that's sort of what we did there. And then we have this final, it's kind of hard to get all in one picture here. So this is the two essential parts. On the other side of the fence, on the right here, we have the jug set up with the catheter line running between them. The jug on the right isn't filled with water. The one up there on the left is pulling water and dumping it into the lower one there, and that's attached to the line, which pulls the bin over and dumps food out. So essentially being a timed feeder, and we experimented with different times and sort of got an idea of depending on the levels and depending on the flow rates is what we would get as far as a time delay. So it took a little bit of experimenting, but that's sort of what we came up with. So this is a picture of the final product set up. It had just dumped some food, and that's Shinte eating some of the food. So we'll talk a little bit about the evaluation. That's the sort of final piece to this, this puzzle that we've been talking about here. So this is so we got to ask ourselves, do we accomplish our goals with this enrichment item? And this is a picture of Shinte after we had set this enrichment item up. We given them a little bit of time to get used to it, so they weren't looking at it or anything like that, so that wouldn't skew our results. We set up the trail camera, and this is a picture of Shinte out at just before 8, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours before they had ever tripped the video on the trail camera. So we had deemed this as a success, although that's not a huge, we'd really like to see them up in the middle of the night or at odd hours, depending on when this is dumping. But that can really be a goal over time. So at the end of the day, our goal was accomplished with this enrichment item. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what evaluation actually looks like. So I just talked about the team all being on the same page, that being super important, understanding that, getting that picture of Shinte eating that food outside of their normal window was success, making sure that everybody's on the same page with that. I find it very effective to have set intervals of evaluation. So evaluating your enrichment program, every 2 weeks, every week, whatever the set interval you want to do, having those set intervals, putting them on your calendar, getting your team on the same page, and really being critical and of these important metrics that you set out. I have this easy flow chart that you can sort of, hang next to your enrichment items and go through with individual enrichment items. I won't go through it, but essentially it's just yes or no questions. You can ask these with a specific enrichment item and really find out if it's effective or not. So the take homes here, what I really believe the fundamentals of a enrichment program, not only for bears, but for a lot of different species, is having that backbone of natural behaviors, really focusing at the end of the day on the individual needs of your bears. That's really, really important and will really, really go a long way because, again, you're not making this enrichment program for a species, you're making this enrichment program for the individuals that you're working with. So making sure their needs are met and adapting the program, despite maybe having evidence one way or another, the individual is the most important here. This concept of contra freeloading, free food versus food they have to work for, super important. Focusing on the variety and variation of not only enrichment items, but also the variation of natural behaviors that you're targeting is super important. Building that, what I like to think of as a tool belt of enrichment, natural behaviors as well as enrichment items. Having these novel enrichment experiences that are super effective for the individuals that you're working with. Goal-based programming and really continuously evaluating these programs over a long period of time is super important. So that is about it for me. That's the bulk of my presentation here. Thanks a lot to the Bear Care Group again for inviting me. This was a lot of fun, and I hope you guys learned something. We can have a sort of a question period now, and we can see how that goes. But thank you all for listening to me for a solid chunk of time there.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, so let's open it up to questions. Throw those in the chat, and I'm going to go back up to the one we had earlier. So Kyle, what sort of adjustments would you make to a program for a large number of bears where it is not possible to give individualized enrichment to each bear? We have 188 bears.
188 bears is a lot of bears. Well, I think the most important here is, again, to focus on those individuals. Sorry, there's a lot of talking there. I think often in my experience, what I've found with large groups of animals is you're going to have animals that are that have certain preferences for different kinds of enrichment. If you have this large group of bears, you might have a certain amount that really prefers one type of enrichment, a certain amount that really prefers another type of enrichment. So trying to sort of spread this group out and really, focusing on those individuals and, dividing them up a little bit, focusing on what are your priority individuals? Do you have individuals that are performing negative behaviors? Do you have individuals that are very, very content? Organizing them into a priority list and kind of breaking it down. It's very overwhelming when you have a large group of animals that you're trying to enrich. So trying to break that down a lot based on the individual is going to go a long way, I think. And I think when you do that, you're really going to find different groups and find it much more manageable to enrich, a bunch of different groups of 5 bears as opposed to one group, one very, very large group. So.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Throw those into the chat.
And again, if you think of any questions and want to reach out later, or you have a more complex question that you want to ask me later, definitely you can shoot me an email, or my website has a contact bar. So if I have a question that's not necessarily appropriate for here, definitely don't hesitate to reach out.
What is your favorite way to encourage denning behaviors?
So we actually recently targeted this with our bears at the Toronto Zoo. And what we did was actually we took a large metal culvert and we actually buried it in the exhibit, and then we covered it up with soil and we put some different scents and things down there. So this was a very, very large culvert, so it obviously took some serious machinery to get it in, but a lot of this denning behavior we had to discourage based on where it was in the exhibit. There was a lot of large rocks that particularly our female really liked to dig around. So with this sort of safe denning area, we were really able to target a specific area that was safe for them, and we essentially increased the square footage of our exhibit by 100 square feet just with this very, very large culvert. And it's since really benefited our bears. So getting them that safe sort of denning area that they can perform this denning behavior is really good. But again, it's going to depend on your individual. Our male isn't really one that we've been able to get this denning behavior out of him. So it's going to really depend on the individual, but that was one of the best ways that I found to encourage it over the long term.
Next question. Can you explain more about what you mean by novel enrichment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a lot of the time when you are talking about novel enrichment, a lot of people think about, an enrichment item that the animal has never received before. And I think that is correct, but it's obvious, but it can really make it complicated to think about and complicated to actually implement into your enrichment program. What I like to think of as novel enrichment is these sort of experiences that the animal might not have got ever, or might not have got in a really long time. So, presenting an old enrichment item in a novel way that it's never received before, or that maybe targets a different natural behavior is really what novel enrichment's going to be. So it's really essentially enrichments that or rich in experience that the animal hasn't received in a long time or ever.
Great. Kyle, I have a question for you on your case study you did with your time release. Did you see any variation? I don't know how many times you've been able to replicate it with seasonality. Curious about in hyperphagia, how the bears responded to having the food quite out of reach.
Yeah, so that's actually a good question, because it's something that we haven't really, they've never had this opportunity before. So it was a lot of learning for us. One of the biggest seasonality changes that we found was Shinte, when she was at her lightest weight and really, wanting food, very food motivated. She was motivated enough to climb the tree and to start to poke at our bin. So we had to sort of, stop giving that for around a month or so, until she was heavy enough and satiated enough that she wouldn't be climbing that. Samson has given no indication of climbing. I think he's a little bit too old for that, but it just goes to show evaluation over time is going to be, not only effective for your enrichment program, but also potentially avoid unsafe behaviors or something like that. Because there's not really much in this, build that we did that we would be too worried if our grizzly bears ripped off the tree. But at the end of the day, that isn't really what we want. So, keeping an eye on that and doing this evaluation seasonally is really important.
Another question we have is, how do you incorporate seasonality into your enrichment program?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to think about with seasonality is looking at how your goals change over that sort of season, and how they change throughout the year. Because if you don't really, I think that's sort of the best way to incorporate it is, that was our goal at the beginning of this sort of case study, was to break up this really rigid schedule that these bears had got into when they were initially waking up from their torpor. But now really they're up a lot of the time, so it's not necessarily as effective right now. So doing those sort of audits that I was talking about at the beginning of that case study, and really taking a step back and looking how the bears are changing, what their preferences are, how those things can be incorporated into your goals, I think is the most important thing for incorporating seasonality, changing those goals and keep updating them as the seasons change.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So we're going to wrap up with that last question there. Feel free to continue to post questions to our Facebook page, and I'll poke Kyle and he can respond throughout the week to continue this discussion. I know everyone's got a lot of good ideas that they've been doing themselves, so feel free to share those on Facebook, so everyone can kind of come up with their own novelty, look at things that they haven't provided their bears, and kind of get that program going if you haven't gotten a program going as of yet. So just a couple of quick notes. This webinar was recorded. We've had a lot of interest on people being able to review these later on. So we will be putting these on our website, or a link through our website in the future. We're just waiting to get most of the webinars together to do it all at once. So be looking for that. If you really love our webinar series, we hope to kind of continue this in the future. Feel free to help support the Bear Care Group. Go to our website. We have different organizations. You can choose like Amazon Smile to help us out, or purchase items through Cafe Press, or just do donations through PayPal. We'd really appreciate it, so we can continue this kind of work and help educate others on proper bear welfare in our habitats. Our next webinar is going to be October 8th, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And it'll be with me. We're going to talk dormancy, and we're going to talk about incorporating dormancy into your husbandry program. for our temperate bears. So I hope you guys will join me. If you haven't signed up already, please go to our website and sign up and register so that we can get you all the links that you need. And we hope to see you then. Thank you, Kyle, so much for joining us. And take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Angela, and thank you to the Bear Care group for inviting me today. And thank you, everybody that tuned in. I hope you enjoyed.
Thanks.